Glad you're all here today. It's a beautiful Lord's Day. Great to have visitors. Montoya, it's great to have your family and friends with us today. Others of you are visiting. Didn't Kyle look distinguished this morning? Tie, the glasses, I'm impressed. Yeah, it's good. It's good. Yeah. This title of the lesson today seems almost as an oxymoron. You don't usually associate blessings and suffering. It's kind of like jumbo shrimp. You don't think about those two like that. So it's just an unusual passage, and one that I think we probably don't like to dwell on, but I think it's a very important part of our Christian walk, and that is simply the blessings of suffering. There's a variety of verses that we could use here, but here is one. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. And there are other parts of that passage that relate to that as well. Over the years, I think we've seen some very unbelievable photographs of what suffering represents. And when I think back to the Vietnam War, this probably is the picture that demonstrates to us the suffering that I just cannot even imagine. And this particular picture symbolizes, I think, so many of the pictures that we saw in Life magazine, Time magazine during the 60s, late 60s and early 70s with the Vietnam War that we had. And of course, there have been many others of those since then, but I think it just demonstrates to us how suffering permeates humanity. C.S. Lewis, a great writer, I'm sure many of you have read much of his work. In the second volume of the Chronicles of Narnia, when Lucy re-enters Narnia, she has not seen Aslan, the lion who represents Jesus, in a long time. Of course, they have a wonderful reunion, and Lucy says, Aslan, you're bigger now. And Aslan says, Lucy, that's because you're older. Every year that you grow, you will find me bigger. I think that's the way it is with us as Christians in terms of our topic today. The older we become, that is to say, the more our relationship with God grows over time, the more we see God's power and love and faithfulness. So the more we age spiritually, the bigger God becomes, and the smaller the suffering seems in comparison. And I think that's what Paul is saying in these verses. We should rejoice when suffering comes because we know God is greater than our problems. In fact, God is big enough, wise enough, powerful enough to use the bad in our lives for our good. In other words, maturing believers know that suffering can be productive and beneficial. And we talked about faith, justified by faith. We've talked about that quite a bit over the last few weeks and looking at Romans. And I think this is one of those passages that tests that for us. Where does our faith lie? And I think that just the essence of being a human often leads us to have our faith tested and as a result, our faith to grow. I mean, think about it. We are born in the midst of pain. Many of the women in here have gone through childbirth, some several times, and you understand the suffering that is involved in birthing. And you're willing to do it because it will be productive. That's the way I think mature believers look at the difficulties of life. They know that God can birth amazing good from even the bad times in life. And I think those people, mature people, can say with Paul in verse 3, we rejoice in suffering because of what we know about it. And we know that all things our loving God works for the good of those who love him. And this is a theme that we see in other places in Romans, especially Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and other places in that area. I think this is one of the hard aspects of maturing Christians. It's hard to accept that life on this earth deals with suffering. If you haven't suffered yet, you will. It's the very nature of being human. And Paul points out there are blessings in this part of life. Being a Christian does not exclude us from suffering. And there are other writers besides Paul who makes this point. For example, 1 Peter 4:12, 13, and James 1 and 2. Basically, it's this idea: consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And then Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. So Paul is saying that suffering can be productive in that it brings special blessings. And what does Paul say these are? Let me share with you what I think are some of those based on what Paul writes here in these verses. Again, as I've said before, you want to keep your Bibles open. I'll be referring to parts of the passage that Alina read to us a few moments ago. I think, number one, suffering is a blessing when it is corrective. Suffering is a blessing when it is corrective. I think that the challenge with this is to know when it is. I think there are lots of times when people think, okay, God is punishing me for something I've done. Well, I think we have to be realistic about this. And there's a lot of suffering that has nothing to do with corrective kinds of things. But this is the kind of suffering that God allows to come in order to nudge us away from the path of rebellion and sin and back on the path of righteousness. When suffering causes us to come to our senses like this, we realize it was indeed a blessing. And this is what the psalmist, I think, is getting at when he says, it was good, it was a blessing for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. And this is one of the lessons we take from the prodigal son, I think. Probably because of his own suffering, he finally realized how foolish he had been, and then he went home and repented and was restored to the Father. I'm sure in hindsight, that person might say, it was a blessing for me to suffer. It was good for me to be so hungry that I considered eating the slop I fed the pigs, because that was the only thing that would correct my selfish, hedonistic, materialistic thinking. And that level of hunger was the only thing that made me hunger to be made right with my Father. And I think we have a variety of examples of that in our culture, in our society today. I think the Hebrew writer also makes this point in Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 5 and following. And you have forgotten that word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? And I think we examine ourselves. I mean, we know ourselves best, and we can get a good handle on when there is suffering that means I need to correct some aspects of my life. When we behave in selfish or foolish or rebellious behavior, we often suffer because of it. And there are a lot of examples of this, but let me just in general give us some that I know we all have read about and maybe have seen in our own families. I think we've seen the consequences of tobacco, both the smokeless, especially among young men, and smoking over a period of decades. We see some of those, and to me those are natural consequences of not treating our bodies well. Excessive drinking. The alcoholic, it's a terrible kind of situation to be in. But a lot of times it's a lack of that self-discipline, whatever that might take. Sexual promiscuity, and we see that a major part of our culture today, that the sexual aspects is not that confined to marriage as it used to be, at least more so than I think it is today. I think there's some of us that have to deal with the consequences of overwork, of spending too much time in the job and too much time in areas that do not allow our bodies to rest. I think, and this is a struggle I know many of us face, is how worry can sometimes overtake us, and there are many physical consequences as a result of that. And again, you can plug in wherever it might fit for you, but there are certain things that we bring upon ourselves just by the way we conduct our lives. But I think that's something that you have to be very discerning about, and not to blame ourselves for things that happen to us that have nothing to do with correction whatsoever. I think a second blessing of suffering is when our response brings God glory. In fact, when we go through suffering and we realize it is not due to our own sins, one of our first thoughts should be to respond to suffering that would point to God. Our suffering can be a blessing to others if our response shows them that our faith in God is well placed. Some of the greatest example we set is when we're going through hard times and we glorify God in whatever way we can. And I think we have many examples of this here at this church. I just want to mention a few in the last few years. Being here as long as I have, I could give you example after example of this kind of thing that I've seen over a period of time. I think some of the best ministry that Ruth and Linda gave was after they knew they had a short time to live. And I think they demonstrated to us their faith and their commitment, and God was glorified because of what they did. Many of you were counseled by those two great women of faith in their last years. And I think the response of Bob and Daryl and others in terms of the deaths of those close to you, it brings God's glory as well. I think one of the things that's touched me most about Greg and Amy and Chris at the death of Marcus is their faithfulness to serving the Lord. It hasn't wavered. In fact, it's increased. You can't help but be around them and see that manifested in their lives. I think we can minister to others through our suffering. Yeah, I think about Rhonda in her recent loss of most of her sight, and how she has, in spite of that, remained faithful and speaks the blessings in Christ, even though she's dealt with those kinds of things. And I think there's so many ways that suffering allows us to minister. I think, who can better minister to an alcoholic than a recovering alcoholic? Who can minister to a brother or sister who's going through a painful time in their personal lives? Maybe a loss of a job. It may be a painful divorce. It may be financial issues. Then someone who's been in those situations themselves. Who can minister best to someone who's dealing with cancer or to heart trouble or whatever it might be than those who've experienced those kinds of things? And I think that's something that is a blessing in suffering that's hard sometimes to fathom, but is one of the great sources of being an example of Jesus Christ, especially to those who have no faith, who have no concern for spiritual things. In verse 5, Paul says that God has poured out his love into our hearts through his Holy Spirit. And when we see others suffer, when we have a parent or a spouse or child or close friend who dies, our faithfulness to God can show others what is really important in our lives. And again, this is not an easy area, I think, in Christianity. One of the most difficult for me. There are times when you stand at a hospital bed and you just think, why? This, and I think it really challenges our faith. And I'm not saying this is easy, and I'm not saying this is always going to work every time, every day. But I think the essence of our maturing as Christians has to do with some of these things I'm talking about this morning. I think the third blessing in suffering is when it is productive for us personally. when we grow from it, when we change because of it. And Paul says that it has really three benefits, and you see this in the passage. Paul says it produces perseverance, it produces character, and it produces hope. First of all, it produces perseverance. The Greek word here literally means to remain firm under pressure. I like that, don't you? To remain firm under pressure. The pressure that difficult times bring are uncomfortable on several levels, and it's something we usually want to get out from under. But if we let God use suffering to teach us to stand firm under pressure. I think another word for perseverance is steadiness, in that our trials can make us more mature, more stable, more steady under pressure. I think we see this with Jesus' ministry. You remember when he and his disciples were crossing the Sea of Galilee in a fishing boat and a storm arose? And while Jesus slept in the back of the boat, the disciples panicked. They shook Jesus and said, "Don't you know we are about to perish?" And Jesus, as you recall from the story, stood up and told them not to panic. And then what did he do? He commanded the wind and the waves to be still, and the storm immediately ended. Now, Jesus, I think, had purpose for that storm in the lives of his disciples. He wanted them to learn that with his presence, they could be steady under pressure. And he wants you and me to learn the same lesson. And maturity comes through those kinds of experiences. If I can make a very, probably too simplistic, secular comparison here, as you all know, I'm a big basketball fan, and to me, one of the exciting parts of any basketball game is it gets down to the last 5 seconds. The score is tied, or there's a team that's ahead by 1 or 2 points. The other team has the ball. And you know, with a bucket or with a three-pointer, the other team, your team wins. You know, who do you want in that situation? You don't want the freshman that is his first year doing anything in front of a huge crowd. You don't want someone who always panics when there is a game on the line. You want that senior who's been through it all. He has been through tight games. He's been through challenging situations in a basketball game. You want that ball in the hands of that mature, experienced player. And to me, that's what we're talking about here. You know, as we grow and develop as Christians, part of our maturity comes through our experiencing all the different things that life brings to us. And we're still steadfast. We're still persevering. Suffering, Paul says, also produces character. Now, the word character is not always a compliment, is it? Yeah, have you ever had somebody explain they're trying to sell a house and they say, well, you know, it's a great property, great location, and the house has character. Okay, what that means is it's barely standing on its, foundation, but it has character. And that's not at all the way we're looking at it here. Paul uses the word in a positive way. He says suffering can produce reliable qualities of humans. If we let God, He will use the difficulties of life to make us into proven, reliable people. The kind of people who have weathered the storms of life and shown by their response that they can be relied on by others. There's a motto, I think, that means something here from one of the Scottish clans that says, I grow under the burden. I grow under the burden. And to me, that is true with us if we let God work in our lives. And again, now, the suffering that we experience, and I'm sure there are people in this room today who are suffering maybe a physical impairment, that you're in constant pain, you have chronic pain, and you deal with this every day. There are others in this who have painful things happening, perhaps in your personal life, and it's a tough time. And there may be some in this room who when you go back to work tomorrow morning, you've got some special challenges that are very unpleasant to deal with. And I don't know what's going on in your lives. And that's something that I struggle with all the years I was teaching, is I would sometimes have students that look just really pained in the audience. And I couldn't tell whether they were pained at me or pained with themselves. And what I've seen with, in fact, let me just mention one that some of you have met. Her name is Holly, and she was one of my students. She's the only person that ever took a course of mine 4 times before she made it through the course. But she did make it successfully, and so she's kind of proud of her record in that regard. But this is a young woman who you name it, and it's happened to her. For example, she never had parents. Think about this. She grew up in what she called the system. She said, at 18, they turned me loose. You have a meal with her. She doesn't even know what it's like to sit at a dinner table with family. She's never done it before. Can you imagine that? And so in addition, she has some health issues. She has a variety of other issues that have come her way because of the kind of situation that she's in. And I just ache for her. Okay, she's one of millions. And I think that tests our faith when we see other people have those kinds of experiences through no fault of their own. And so I think this whole area we're talking about today is not an easy one. Certainly not an easy one for me, and I think we all struggle with this idea of suffering and how it relates to our Christian walk. And I hope when you study the questions today in your life groups that you can come to grips with some of these things and share some of those things and your theology as it relates to this. Let me give you one other example, I think, that demonstrates something about the whole business of suffering. And this is from Harry Emerson Fosdick. Again, a great preacher from an earlier generation. His works, some of his scripts of sermons are brilliant. Has had an incredible influence in religion over the past many decades. But he tells about a visit he made to apple orchard in the state of Maine. He said he saw apples so loaded down with fruit that their branches had to be propped up to keep them off the ground. And when he asked the apple grower why these particular trees were so loaded with fruit, the farmer told him to look at the trunks of the trees near the ground. He did, and he noticed that the tree had been severely wounded with deep gashes that had healed over. He noticed that the tree had been severely wounded. And the apple grower then explained the reason for the gashes. He said, "We have discovered that when an apple tree begins to run to wood and leaves and not to fruit, if we will gash it deeply, it will almost always produce more apples." We don't know everything about how it works, but we know that the more the tree is bruised, the more it seems to produce. And I think in Romans 5, the text we've used today, Paul is saying the same thing. Suffering in the life of a believer produces a character of the highest quality. Okay, the last thing that Paul says that it will help you personally is that it produces hope. Now, he's not talking about a wish or a possibility, but rather a certainty. The certainty that God is using our sufferings to make us more and more Christ-like. He is saying that we are now being rebuilt and changed to become more like Jesus as we grow in Christ-like love, maturity, wisdom, and patience. All the fruits of the Spirit. And you see, Jesus didn't just come to save us from death. He came to transform our lives. He wants to make us over into the person He created us to be, the person that deep down in our hearts we've always longed to be. He wants to make us more and more like Him. You can mark this down. The road to maturity is paved with struggle. And I would suggest you ask any of the saints of old. Ask Abraham and he will point to Mount Moriah. Ask Jacob and he will point to a pillow of stone. Ask Joseph and he will point to an Egyptian prison. Ask Moses and he will point to the backside of the desert. Ask the 3 Hebrew children and they will point to a fiery furnace. Ask Daniel and he'll point to a den of lions. Ask Peter and he will point to a Roman fire and his 3 denials. Ask John and he will point to Patmos. Ask any believer who has traveled with Jesus and he will tell you that God's blessings are sometimes poured from suffering. This is not an easy ending to have for an invitation, I guess, but I certainly want to allow that to happen if any of you need to respond and you would like to be baptized or you'd like for us to pray with you, whatever that situation might be, we'd love to do it. I'd like to end instead this morning with the prayer. And if you would bow with me, and then when the prayer is over, we will stand and sing. Dear God, we praise you for your love and for demonstrating that love by sending your only Son to earth to save us at just the right time. Dear God, please fill our hearts with your love so that we never doubt it, even in the midst of life's hardships. We praise you for your power. Help us to rest our faith in our faith that there is nothing you cannot do through us. And dear God, let the peace of Christ rule in our hearts, since as members of one body we were called to peace. Let the word of Christ dwell in us richly, and whatever we do in word or deed, let us do it all in the name of Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. In his name I pray, and amen. Let's stand and sing.